Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to assemble a cadre of writers, thinkers, and teachers who are transforming the world one character at a time. And it all starts with one thing, a deep understanding of human motivation, why people do what they do, and the forces that drive them. This is episode 26, the subgroups within the empathy group. Last podcast, we talked about the 28 character traits and how they were divided into 4 different groups. We quickly reviewed each of the groups and explained how the groups are divided up based on their function. We said that the balance group had to do with the character's internal relationship with himself. How much self-mastery did he have? We said that the resilience group was how our character reacts to the outside world, to the struggles, the difficulties, and the challenges of life. We can think of the resilience group as being the courage group. The insight group relates to wisdom. It relates to the degree to which our character is aware of what's around him, what's going on around him, how well he can predict the outcome of his own behavior, and how open he is to being taught by others. And the empathy group, which we're going to focus on tonight, has to do with our character's relationships with other human beings. It's a person-to-person group. All of the character traits in this group, and there are 13 of them, more than any other group, have to do with doing well in a relationship. This should not be surprising given that these character traits have come about through social evolution and biological evolution for survival. And survival was very, very dependent on relationships all through mankind's history. And it's really only in more recent years that we are testing the ability to live without these relationships, but we're tending to label it loneliness and not be terribly happy with the outcome. So it's not surprising that the largest number of character traits have to do with our relationships with one another. And tonight we're going to look at how those empathy traits subdivide themselves into 4 groups. The first group that we'll take a look at can be called the dependability group. Any one of the traits in the dependability group is critical for our character to be considered dependable. Loyalty, responsibility, sincerity, trustworthiness, they all go together to produce a character that can be relied upon, is dependable, and can be let go unsupervised. Any one of these that fail is going to result in a character that is not dependable. The interesting thing about these character traits, and this goes for all 28 character traits, not just the 4 in the dependability subgroup of the empathy group, all character traits are independent dimensions. Each one can be independently assigned to a character in any of the 4 positions depending on the voices that are going on in the character's mind. So what that means is that even though, say, responsibility and trustworthiness, you might think of them as being very, very similar, are we in fact looking at 2 different character traits, or are we looking at 2 sides of the same coin, 2 names for the same character trait? Well, the interesting thing about character traits is that there exists a test by which you can determine whether you have 2 different character traits or 2 names for the same character trait. And that test is as follows. If you can take one of the character traits and assign it up there in the pinnacle trait, inaccessible to our character, can't hardly even think about obeying its norms, and you can take the other one and put it down in a base trait where it's just intrinsic, so solidly a part of the character's life that we call that the zone of being. So you can take any two character traits that you might think are actually just one trait and split them up in that way and test to determine whether or not they're actually independent traits. And all of these are. We will be diving the next level down when we get down to the individual character traits. We'll put this to the test and we'll demonstrate that this is true. But let's move on to the next subgroup within the empathy group because we're doing this kind of top-down. The next subgroup within the empathy group is the livability group. The livability group has to do with how comfortable is it to have this character around. Affability, courtesy, kindness, respect. Again, these are character traits that seem so similar. Are we sure they're independent? We'll test that in a future podcast. But the livability subgroup all has to do with, gee, would you want to be a roommate of this guy? Would you want to have this gal as your co-worker? Because when these traits are all solid in the character, that character is much more comfortable to have around. And when these fail, the character can be very bristly to be in the vicinity of. Continuing in our circular path here, we get to response. Response isn't, it's a noun just like livability and dependability, but it's a different sort of a noun. Response has to do with the character's reaction to the gifts that he has been given. These traits, gratitude, generosity, transcendence, reflect what kind of a response to the giver of gifts is our character making. So it's still an empathy trait because there's a relationship there, but this is a relationship of recognizing that the good things that the character has may not be just totally their own manufacture, but in fact there is some response that's owed, some gratitude, generosity, and sharing, etc. And to complete the circle, the last subgroup we'll take a look at is the honor subgroup. The honor subgroup has to do with asymmetrical relationships. That's the key point of distinction that separates the honor subgroup from the other three. In the honor subgroup, our character is small potatoes compared to someone else in the relationship. And we won't go into the teasing out of it, but you can about guess between obedience and patriotism who does our character owe looking up to. So these are non-asymmetrical relationships. So in coming days, we're going to go through each of the groups of character traits and talk about how the subgroups divide themselves out. Because the important thing here that we're working on is we're establishing a taxonomy. And the difference between a taxonomy and a classification system is that a taxonomy arises out of principles. It arises out of conditions that can be tested, that naturally group and classify and give order. Whereas a classification system is just a checklist. If it checks this, this, and this, yeah, it goes in this box, otherwise it goes in that box. And you can't really give too much of a reason or a rationality. And we're all about establishing reasons and rationality so that when we're done, we know we have a complete group. And that will be a rather interesting test because there are lots of other sources that propose character traits different from the ones that we have here. And we'll be able to check out, based on the taxonomy, whether or not that the trait that's coming in is just a different name for one that we already have, or whether it even actually qualifies as a character trait. So I hope you will come back in tomorrow night, and we'll continue talking about the taxonomy of character traits. Bye-bye.